To your left and right are shelves stocked full of goods, just waiting for a hand to reach out and grab them. I'm sure this is an experience familiar to all of you. It's a mundane experience, a chore even. Something that's so familiar it might not seem worth making a video over. So why am I making a video over this? Well, because it wasn't always like this. It took the vision of one man to change the way we shop forever. And in its wake came other unforeseen changes to our way of life, both good and bad. This is the story of Piggly Wiggly and the birth of the modern grocery store. So I hear you saying, what was the grocery shopping experience like before the Piggly Revolution? Well, shopping differs from region to region. But as an American, I'm going to give you an American-centric view into shopping pre-Piggly Wiggly. In many parts of the country, you would have a general store that stocked various goods and sundries. You would hand a clerk a list of groceries you wanted, and the clerk would put your order together and either hand you your groceries wrapped or in a box, or in many cases, delivered to your home. If you've ever seen The Godfather Part 2, you may remember that a young Vito Corleone, portrayed by Robert De Niro, works as a clerk at a grocery sometime in the late 19-teens, probably 1917. There's a deleted scene where Vito is making a delivery of groceries when he comes across some street toughs assaulting Don Fanucci. Vito later loses his job to Fanucci's nephew, after Fanucci intimidates the grocery store owner into giving him a job. Vito then declines an offer for some groceries as a consolation. But hey, this isn't a movie review, so back to Piggly Wiggly. The point is, due to having to use clerks to put people's orders together and then deliver those orders to customers, groceries could serve fewer customers, and prices were higher as a consequence. As Clarence Saunders, the founder of Piggly Wiggly, explains in his patent, the invention has for its purpose to provide a store equipment by which the customer will be enabled to serve himself, and in doing so will be required to review the entire assortment of goods carried in stock, conveniently and attractively displayed, and after selecting the list of goods desired, will be required to pass a checking and paying station at which the goods selected may be packed, and settlement, therefore, may be made before retiring from the store. Sounds pretty intuitive, right? The concept is so familiar to us today that it seems the idea would have been obvious and therefore the taking for anyone with the means to implement it. But it wasn't so. In fact, Saunders had many naysayers who predicted his venture would fail. The reasons were numerous and not without merit. Either people would steal merchandise or balk at the prospect of carrying their own groceries home, or the margins would be too small, or all of the above. Now, it should be said that Piggly Wiggly's status as the world's first self-service grocery is disputed. For example, Alpha Beta, formerly Gerard Brother and Hansen, had a form of self-service before Piggly Wiggly first opened. So why does Piggly Wiggly get the credit? Well, it's because, while they might not have been the first, their impact on the grocery landscape is indisputable. They were the catalyst that kicked off the self-service transformation. This isn't to say that full-service grocery businesses closed overnight. In fact, many would continue to operate for decades, but the self-service model would quickly become the dominant form. If there's one thing I've learned about Clarence Saunders in researching the history of Piggly Wiggly, it's that he was a man of action, a relentless innovator, always looking for the next big thing. Saunders was well suited to be the man to lead the self-service revolution. He grew up in Virginia, in a poor family, and even worked as a sharecropper as a child. When he was 14, he began working full-time, from 5 a.m. to 10 p.m. in a general store, Saunders moved to Memphis in 1903, shortly after getting married, and began working in the grocery distribution industry. According to Saunders, his inspiration for the self-service model came when he visited an undisclosed grocer, thought to be Oakley's, in Terre Haute, Indiana. As Saunders later recounted, he developed the concept of the self-service grocery rather quickly. I was in the wholesale grocery business. A businessman requested me to go with him to Terre Haute to study a new type of store, which was setting merchandising records. He was thinking about opening such a store himself. I went with the man. In Terre Haute, I found the only new thing was that this man had plenty of customers. I got on the train and started home. I arranged the floor plan of the store in my mind. This brought up the idea of self-service. I got home on a Saturday evening. I made my arrangements that night. Sunday, I announced that Piggly Wiggly would be opened. In a week, it was opened. It was the store at 79 Jefferson, and it was the first of the Piggly Wiggly chain. The first Piggly Wiggly opened on September 6, 1916, on 79 Jefferson Street in Memphis, Tennessee, although they wouldn't start serving customers until September 11. Ever the showman, Saunders opened the store to great fanfare with a brass band on hand and a beauty contest with cash prizes. Saunders had teased the residents of Memphis for weeks before with cryptic messages on billboards, such as one that said, "Mrs. Brown asked Mr. Brown to stop by the Piggly Wiggly on the way home." On August 27, 1916, Saunders put out an ad in a Memphis newspaper, hinting at things to come. The Piggly Wiggly would be born in a few days, not with a silver spoon in his mouth, but a work shirt on his back. No goods will be delivered, even though one purchased $100 worth, and even though an offer was made to pay for delivery. The Piggly Wiggly will not own a delivery outfit. It will not hire one for any occasion. Groceries, fruits, and meats will be sold for less margin of profit than ever before in the history of merchandising. Piggly Wiggly was a smash hit, and Saunders quickly opened a second store, dubbed Prince Piggly Wiggly, on October 21st. A third and fourth followed before the end of 1916. The following year saw the first Piggly Wiggly that opened outside of Memphis in Houston, Texas. In 1918, Saunders, along with a group of investors, founded the Piggly Wiggly Corporation, and in the same year, Saunders sold his patents, trademarks, and licensing agreements to the corporation for $550,000. Thus, Piggly Wiggly began licensing out its name and self-service patents, which helped lead to its explosive growth. Franchisees were expected to pay an upfront franchise fee based on the population of the area, plus 0.5% of the sales at the franchise. Piggly Wiggly began using the phrase, "all over the world," an apt description of Piggly Wiggly's dizzying growth. The pig wasn't without competition, however, both from established brands and from aspiring startups like Piggly Wiggly itself. At the time, some of the largest grocers in the U.S. included names such as Kroger, Safeway, and the biggest of them all, the Great Atlantic and Pacific Tea Company, usually referred to as A&P. Unless you've lived in the American Northeast, you may have never heard of A&P before, but they were once the largest grocer in the United States, claiming 10% of all grocery sales at their peak. They were basically the Walmart of their day, but such was the influence of the pig that A&P would go on to adopt the self-service model. On the other end, some smaller businesses attempted to ride the coattails of the pig's success to boost their own businesses. One funny example is that of Hoggly Woggly, a not too subtle hint at Piggly Wiggly's whimsical name. Unsurprisingly, Hoggly Woggly was hit with a judicial decision that prohibited them from using that name. Saunders' fight to maintain his claim on the self-service grocery model finally met its demise when he pursued a legal challenge against the grocery chain, Jitney Jungle. Jitney Jungle was able to win the case by proving that the self-service model existed before Piggly Wiggly and were allowed to continue their business. It was a brilliant legal defense by Jitney Jungle in that they were able to undermine Saunders' strongest argument that he invented the self-service model. And also, let's be honest, Oggly Woggly is a dumb name, just begging for a lawsuit. Speaking of names, the origin of the name Piggly Wiggly may be the most enduring mystery of the company's history. Saunders was evasive when asked about the origin of the name, and had given numerous different accounts. Unfortunately, it seems as though we'll never get a definitive answer to this mystery. By 1921, only 5 years after the first Piggly Wiggly had opened, Piggly Wiggly had grown to become the third largest grocery chain in the United States, with over 600 stores owned or leased in 40 different states. It's hard to overstate the impact that Piggly Wiggly had and continues to have on consumers today. Piggly Wiggly can claim credit to many firsts in the grocery industry, including marking each item with a price tag, providing baskets and carts for customers to use while shopping, stocking brand name items in stores nationwide, using refrigerated fixtures to maintain freshness, introducing the checkout stand where customers would have their items rung and bagged, and many other firsts. I'd like to go into more detail with some of these innovations, as they seem obvious to us today, but were revolutionary for their time. First, the price tags. These are some of the early tags, used to denote the prices, in cents, of the stocked items. Saunders, being a hands-on type of guy, was actually responsible for the creation of many of these fixtures used by the first Piggly Wigglies. Here's a pegboard used to organize the price tags. In addition, because people were now responsible for selecting their own groceries, a method of holding these groceries had to be devised with a basket as the obvious solution. The customer, upon entering the shopping area, through the turnstile, would grab a basket to assist them. Shopping carts would come later. A funny bit of history behind shopping carts. When they were first introduced, people were hesitant to use them, in particular men, who found the carts emasculating, because the carts reminded many people of a baby carriage. And what self-respecting early 20th century man could be seen in public pushing a stroller around? Because people, instead of the employees, were the ones making the decisions, manufacturers had to make attractive packaging and engage in self-promotion to catch the eye of potential customers. Even today, a lot of work goes into package design of all the goods you buy at the grocery. You may believe that doesn't make a difference, or that it doesn't influence your decision making. But just think for a moment. Surely there were times in your life you made the decision not to purchase an item because the packaging looked cheap or unprofessional. Packaging matters, and I think it would be naive to suggest that it doesn't. The last thing I'll go into detail about is refrigeration. Refrigeration didn't necessarily mean electrification, particularly in the early 20th century. Often, people had ice boxes in their home, which served the same purpose as modern refrigerators. And ice would be delivered by, you guessed it, the Iceman. I should note that ice boxes were actually called refrigerators, and that the term icebox came into popular usage after electrical refrigeration became common. Here's the design of a milk refrigerator that would have been used in the Piggly Wigglies. The ice block would be placed into the compartment up top, and the melted water would be collected in the drip pan at the bottom of the refrigerator. In this way, perishable foods, such as dairy and meat, could be kept fresh longer. Let's delve a little deeper into the actual workings of an early Piggly Wiggly. Here we have a floor plan of a Piggly Wiggly taken from a 1920 patent. Once the customer passes through the turnstile and picks up a basket, the customer takes a one-way route, snaking their way up and down the aisles. A very deliberate design element as described by Saunders in his patent. The spaces between the cabinets form aisles, which, with said passageways, forms a circuitous path between the respective rows of shelvings or cabinets. This circuitous path must be traversed by every purchaser who enters the room, and while following this path, the customer has displayed before him, for selection, the varied stock of goods that is offered for sale. This way, the customer is forced to look at all the goods and perhaps make impulse purchases, which wasn't really a thing before the pig. Impulse purchases are still a part of our grocery shopping experience. I mean, why do you think groceries stock things like gum, candy, and other small items next to the registers? By the way, I want to get back to the topic of turnstiles for a bit. No, they're not just for public transportation. They were, in fact, an iconic part of the Piggly Wiggly brand. Not only did it make customers move in one direction, but it let shop owners know how many people came in. It seems to be an antiquated and an inconvenience, until I noticed one of my neighborhood Walmarts has a similar fixture. Getting back on topic, once the customer has made their selection, the items are then wrung out and bagged free of charge by the cashier. This is an interesting concept to consider. Many people at the time doubted a person's willingness to carry their own groceries home, but those doubts turned out to be unfounded as the self-service model boomed. It reminds me of when self-checkout lanes were first introduced about a decade ago. I recall hearing people being skeptical that we would be willing to do the job of the cashier and wring out our own groceries. There were also concerns that theft would be rampant, and I'm not saying that theft doesn't happen, but self-checkout lanes now dominate groceries today, and I'm not passing judgment on whether it's good or bad, but we only have ourselves to blame for its proliferation. Anyways, like any business, Piggly Wiggly would have to change with the times. Competitors recognized the benefits of this new model, and many of them adopted or even franchised Piggly Wigglies themselves. In fact, established chains such as Kroger and Safeway would themselves operate Piggly Wigglies. At one point, in 1929, Safeway operated about a third of all Piggly Wigglies. It should be noted that even today, many Piggly Wigglies are operated by franchisees, many of them independent. Not a man to rest on his achievements, Saunders dreamed big. And what better way to raise capital than to take your business public? Thus, on February 22, 1922, Piggly Wiggly was listed on the New York Stock Exchange. On April 22, 1922, Saunders sold 50,000 stock at $43 a share, raising more than $2 million. Saunders then purchased a large tract of land in Memphis and constructed a luxurious home, which he intended to call Clos La Claire, named after his children. Instead, it was dubbed the Pink Palace by Memphis residents due to its use of pink marble. The building today serves as a museum and contains a replica of the first Piggly Wiggly. Things were looking up for Clarence Saunders. Piggly Wiggly was booming. He was a civic leader, an admired entrepreneur in Memphis. But little did he know that his foray into the stock market would ultimately lead to his downfall. One could make a fortune on the stock market, or one could lose a fortune, particularly if you were to deal in options. The pig had rapidly expanded, perhaps too rapidly, and many people viewed it fit for slaughter. And thus Saunders was introduced to the world of options. Saunders discovered there were people short-selling his stock, in essence, predicting a downturn in Piggly Wiggly's fortunes. Angered by this speculation, Saunders vowed to purchase any and all available shares to put the hurt on short sellers. Saunders' purchasing spree was not cheap, and he had to raise capital from other investors to help fund the stock buyback. To put it simply, Saunders was cornering the market, that is, controlling so much of one commodity that he could effectively control the price of said commodity. Saunders completed his corner on March 20th of 1923 by calling for delivery of his stock, therefore forcing short sellers into paying a punishing difference in their speculated contract price and the current value of the stock. Many short sellers who had purchased on margin found it impossible to sell since they could not produce certificates. Saunders had won, but it had cost him $12 million, and his victory would be short-lived. Saunders was an outsider, and Wall Street was none too pleased at his attempt at market manipulation. The next day, March 21st, the New York Stock Exchange suspended trading of Piggly Wiggly, and the day after, removed it altogether, Officials of the New York Stock Exchange argued that Saunders had violated their terms of agreement in not leaving a pool of outstanding shares available for people to purchase. Now heavily in debt, Saunders turned to Memphis, the city that started it all, to help save him. In May of 1923, the Memphis Chamber of Commerce organized a banquet to raise money to help Saunders pay off his debt and keep control of Piggly Wiggly in Memphis. Unfortunately for Saunders, the bad news kept coming, of which he was partially to blame. In the midst of his financial misfortunes, and Memphis rallying around his cause, reports of Saunders' lavish spending made the news. And this is where the Pink Palace re-enters the story. A story highlighting the eye-watering cost of Saunders' new estate made it to the front page of a local Memphis newspaper, with Saunders declaring he would finish the project regardless of cost. Saunders endured criticism from those who were willing to help, but also expected Saunders to help his own cause. When it was suggested that a committee should oversee the finances of Piggly Wiggly, Saunders balked at the suggestion, and the campaign to assist Saunders ended almost as quickly as it had begun. Finally, on August 13, 1923, Saunders stepped down as president of Piggly Wiggly, having sold nearly all of his assets, including the title to the Pink Palace, which was not yet complete. Many of the assets Saunders sold were Piggly Wiggly stores that were sold to competing grocery chains who wanted to eliminate local competition. Saunders was no longer in control of Piggly Wiggly, but it wasn't over for him. He would face years of legal battles related to his time with Piggly Wiggly. Now, I don't know why I find this funny, but Saunders was not a man who would back down from a fight, and he and his opponents would spar with one another through newspapers and the radio. There were countless ads, including full-page ads, in which a war of words would take place. I've read a number of these full-page diatribes, and the animosity is clear. What's also clear is that both sides would massage the facts of the case to sway public opinion in their direction. If this took place today, people would be posting insults on Twitter, Instagram, and YouTube. As I've long said, times change, but people stay the same. After Saunders' exit from Piggly Wiggly, he started a new grocery business called Clarence Saunders, sole owner of my name, which was simply referred to as sole owner by most people. It was no Piggly Wiggly, but a modest success nonetheless. By 1927, Saunders would own or lease over 200 sole owner stores in 15 states. His new venture began controversially, however, as Saunders' former creditors attempted to prevent him from opening another grocery chain, claiming he was violating the very patents he drafted, then lost control of. Ultimately, Saunders prevailed and he was allowed to continue his business. As far as the name of his new business, Clarence Saunders, sole owner of my name, this was Saunders thumbing his nose at those who tried to prevent him from opening a new business. He would go on to start another grocery business called Key Doozle in 1937. This was a further evolution of Saunders' desire to create an autonomous grocery shopping experience. Unfortunately for Saunders, the technology wasn't there and the public wasn't ready for this complicated shopping experience. And his final venture was his least successful one. A final word about Saunders. Before he died of a heart attack on October 14, 1953, he was working on another automated grocery concept called Food Electric. I've read various accounts describing it as a precursor to today's automated checkout lanes, but my reading of it is a little different. The way I see it, it was essentially Key Doozle, except this time simplified and with a more robust item delivery system, which is what doomed Key Doozle in the first place. Here's how Food Electric was described a few months before Saunders' death. Clarence Saunders will open new store. Food Electric, plan announced by inventor. Clarence Saunders, originator of the Piggly Wiggly system of self-service groceries, on which the entire self-service grocery industry has grown, is going into business again. Several years ago, Mr. Saunders originated the Key Doozle stores, which called for too much complicated machinery. The new plan, he reports, is much simpler. With his Food Electric, he declares 4 people can operate a store, doing a $1 million annual business. His new plan is for a tiny adding machine and a small rectangular piece of metal with a pistol-like handle on it, this being called a key, As each customer gets a basket, he gets a key. Food items will be in display cases with prices on tape under each item. Also under each item is a slot. The customer inserts his key for the article desired, and it falls through the slot into his basket. At the checkout counter, his articles are sacked and his total shows on his key. With his new system, he figures he can undersell other groceries by 10%. Now, I don't know about you, but this doesn't sound like the automated checkout lanes we have today. It kinda sounds like another key doozle, but hey, we'll never know. And thus ends the life story of a man, unfamiliar to most, but having indirectly impacted the lives of all of us. Getting back to the pig. After Saunders departed in 1923, control of the company went to C.D. Smith, a Memphis businessman who greatly expanded the pig's footprint. Smith wouldn't remain the head of the pig for long, and in 1926, Joe Maury became the head of Piggly Wiggly. By the end of the decade, there were 3,000 Piggly Wiggly stores in operation. Unfortunately for Piggly Wiggly, actually for everyone in the world, the stock market crashed in 1929, and the Great Depression hurt businesses all around the world. Having spent the 1920s expanding at a breakneck pace, the pig had overexpanded, and the 1930s would not be a kind decade for the pig. Kroger and Safeway, the two largest franchisees of Piggly Wiggly, both reduced their stakes in the business. Safeway, which had once operated more than 950 Piggly Wigglies in 1929, had only 130 in operation by 1937. In terms of total Piggly Wigglies in operation, they fell from a high of about 3,000 in 1929 to about 1,300 in 1937. Net profit during this time period had decreased by about 75%. Additionally, by this time, most of the groceries had caught on to the self-service model and didn't feel the need to piggyback on Piggly Wiggly. Even Piggly Wiggly began to change. The continuous aisle outlined in Saunders' early patent gave way to open aisles, a familiar sight to us today, and even the iconic turnstiles began to disappear in some Piggly Wigglies. At this point, Piggly Wiggly was just, well, another grocery store. By the late 1940s, Piggly Wiggly had contracted, and their stores were mostly concentrated in their traditional stronghold, the South, which, not coincidentally, is where Piggly Wiggly has their greatest presence today. During this time period, Piggly Wiggly was under the ownership of William Lovett. Lovett had purchased Piggly Wiggly in 1939 from Kroger, which was then based in Atlanta. In 1950, Lovett moved the headquarters of Piggly Wiggly to his hometown of Jacksonville, Florida. He would continue to run Piggly Wiggly until his death in 1978. So what does the future hold for Piggly Wiggly? Well, apart from Piggly Wiggly's last great expansion, under the leadership of company president G.C. Brannan during the 1950s, who expanded the pig's footprint to nearly 1,000 stores, Piggly Wiggly would not see any success remotely similar to their initial major expansion in the 1920s. In fact, Piggly Wiggly used to have an international presence with hundreds of locations in Canada and even across the Atlantic, but now is confined to the United States. As former Piggly Wiggly president Lawrence Crane once said, "There's no need for us to think about being an international concern now," adding, "We have enough problems here in the good old USA." Further, the rise of Walmart as the current behemoth of the grocery world and the spread of discount grocers like Family Dollar and Dollar General into rural, underserved areas has further eroded Piggly Wiggly's position. Today, Piggly Wiggly maintains about 500 stores in 18 states, focused mainly in the South, but also with a strong presence in Wisconsin. The Piggly Wiggly footage at the beginning of this video was shot in Athens, Texas, located about an hour and a half southeast of Dallas. The experience was not so different from any other grocery. One thing I noticed, and this is a common sight amongst many groceries today, is the presence of private label items. Piggly Wiggly is no different and has been selling private label items alongside brand-named items for decades. Today, Piggly Wiggly private label is sold under the name food club. And I've got to say, I've noticed a pretty stark difference in the prices between their private label and brand name items. In fact, I would estimate that most of the brand named items I saw in Piggly Wiggly were being sold at a higher price than the local Walmart. But I suppose in a business of small margins, you have to make your money where you can. It's hard to overstate how much of an impact the self-service revolution has had on our lives. I know this isn't talked about much or given much thought, and I understand why. It's not an exciting or sexy topic. It's essentially, as I stated before, a chore. And not just any chore. It is, in fact, mandatory, like taxes, because, after all, who can survive without food? One final thought came to me as I was formulating this video while shopping. While I was pushing my cart down an aisle, I noticed a personal shopper filling up a cart, undoubtedly for someone who was doing their shopping online, and is either going to do a curbside pickup or going to have their groceries delivered to them. It's funny how history sometimes repeats itself. There's a saying, often attributed to Mark Twain, that history doesn't repeat itself, but it often rhymes. With services today, such as Instacart and Amazon Fresh, grocery delivery has seen a resurgence in popularity. So we've come full circle, from home deliveries to self-service, back to home deliveries. Although I'm not predicting that home deliveries will once again become the dominant form of obtaining groceries, it is interesting to see how with new technology, what's old is new, but, better. If you've made it to the end of my long and, frankly, boring video, thanks. I certainly hope that topics such as this one are interesting to you since they're interesting to me. Please like and subscribe for more content like this, and I hope to see you in my next video. Thanks, and have a nice day.